Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It is a privilege to be able to speak to Bill C-9, although I have grave concerns with not the objective, but the manner in which the Liberals have gone about trying to achieve that. Let me, from the outset, say that I'm grateful the Liberals have finally recognized that there is a wave of hate sweeping this country. I'm glad they've realized what the Jewish community in this country, among others, has been crying out for years, which is a government that will listen to these concerns and understand the very real threats that are targeting them on a regular basis. But just as the Liberals have done with Bill C-2, just as they've done on the firearms file, they take a legitimate issue and they offer a remedy that attacks the rights of citizens and expands the state's power, often without the checks and balances necessary. Now, Bill C-9 does 5 things. It repeals the requirement that the Attorney General consents to proceedings for hate charges. It creates an offence of willfully promoting hatred against an identifiable group by displaying certain symbols in a public place. It creates a hate crime offence for committing an offence that is motivated by hate. It creates an offence of intimidating a person to impede them from accessing certain places predominantly used for religious worship. And it creates an offence of intentionally obstructing or interfering with a person's lawful access to such places. Now, of these 5 things, 3 of them are already covered by existing laws. Creating an offence of willfully promoting hatred by displaying a symbol. Section 319(2) of the Criminal Code already targets the willful promotion of hatred. It targets incitement of hatred, and the courts have been very broad in their interpretation of how that communication must take place. Symbols are a part of that. And I could actually give an example from my own riding, where someone was charged just within the last 2 weeks in Central Elgin, Ontario, with a hate charge under 319(2) after having mowed a swastika into their front lawn. The display of a hate symbol led to a hate charge under the existing law. Creating a hate offense is also redundant because hate motivation is already an aggravating factor under Section 718(2) of the Criminal Code, and it has been consistently applied by the courts. Creating offenses for intimidation and obstruction at places of worship, already criminalized under Section 423 of the Criminal Code, Section 431 and 434.1, as well as under the laws pertaining to threats, 264.1. And so what we are left with, when we strip away these 3 things which are already covered by existing laws, are 2 things. C-9 really does 2 things. Number 1, it removes the requirement for the Attorney General to consent. Now, this has been viewed by activists and advocates on the left and the right in this country as a necessary safeguard against overzealous and political prosecutions by law enforcement or by Crown attorneys or by law enforcement that simply don't understand this because it is a rarely applied provision of the law. And the next part of it, and this is the most egregious part and where I will spend the remainder of my time, Madam Speaker, the government is codifying a new definition of hate. A new definition of hate. Now, Bill C-9 describes hatred as, quote, the emotion that involves detestation or vilification and that is stronger than disdain or dislike. Now, the government has said this is adapted from the Keegstra Supreme Court decision, a seminal free expression case in Canada, but it actually changes something very key. In Keegstra, the court held that hatred connotes emotion of an intense and extreme nature that is clearly associated with vilification and detestation. This was expanded on in the Watcott decision, which says hate is extreme manifestations of the emotion described by the words detestation and vilification. The word extreme does not appear in Bill C-9. Now, the government is very proud of this bill. The government has had all summer to work on it. They have had, I don't know how many stakeholders, staffers, bureaucrats, lawmakers, and lawyers look over it with I imagine every clause with a fine-tooth comb. Omitting a word, an operative word, a very key word in a very key section of this bill is no accident. The government is, to use a legal term, willfully lowering the threshold on what constitutes hate, by extension expanding the state's power and lowering the threshold of what can be regarded as free expression in this country. Now, why this is so important to me and to the Canadians who have been speaking out about Bill C-9 to this point, Madam Speaker, is because this government has been, to its credit, very transparent on where it wants to go on free expression. In the last two parliaments, the Liberal government has introduced sweeping censorship bills that have been decried by voices on the left and the right, under the auspices of tackling so-called online harms. Now, the Liberals have told us as recently as last week that this is coming back. The online harms bill is still very much a live issue. So we cannot look at Bill C-9 in isolation. We cannot disentangle it from this Liberal government's stated attitudes already about freedom of expression and, quite frankly, the contempt in which they hold free expression and open debate. Now, I'm going to quote someone that I believe the Liberals have a great affinity for, and that is former Canadian Chief Justice Beverley McLachlin. In her Keegstra dissent, she wrote, "If the guarantee of free expression is to be meaningful, it must protect expression which challenges even the very basic conceptions about our society. A true commitment to freedom demands nothing less." Freedom of expression, I should say, demands nothing less. We do not need to look far to see what happens when the threshold for hate is lowered. In the United Kingdom, police are not even rarely knocking on doors and arresting people over mean tweets, because the same desire that we're seeing behind some of the negative and concerning impulses in C-9 is criminalizing hate based on the grounds that words are violence. Censors justify their limitations on freedom of expression by elevating speech to violence. It is not for the state to discern, let alone prosecute, hate that may exist in one's heart. The law is to punish action, and the existing laws already do this. Now, I'd be remiss to not point out that the Liberals only get tough on crime when they're talking about thought criminals. These are the only people that the Liberals want to put behind bars. So let's look at some of the real hate crimes across the country. According to Juno News, 130 some odd churches have been vandalized or victimized by arson since 2021. Synagogues in Canada have been firebombed and vandalized, and Jewish schools have been shot at. If the Liberals were serious about real hate crimes, they would be seeking mandatory 10-year prison sentences for these heinous assaults on places of worship. Again, the law should punish bad behavior and not bad feelings. And to be fair, we cannot confront the hatred that exists in Canada and in Canadian society without acknowledging some of the root causes of it. The crisis of hate is a direct consequence of 10 years of divisive Liberal identity politics and the reckless breaking of the immigration system by this Liberal government. We cannot talk about hate without talking about the breaking of the immigration system that has resulted in the importation of foreign conflicts and, in some cases, very hateful ideologies into this country. Now, much of this happened on the watch of the Justice Minister who tabled this bill. He was the immigration minister who looked at the first 6 years of Justin Trudeau's government and how immigration was bungled there and said, "Don't worry, I can do worse." And he did. It's no coincidence that hate crimes have risen as Canada has become less discerning and more reckless in its handling of the immigration system. This is a crisis of the Liberals' creation. I do not trust those who caused the problem to solve it. And I think all people who may agree with the motivation behind this bill should be very cautious to hand over this level of power to the Liberals when they have already demonstrated where they want to go. They have already demonstrated what they want to do. I'll return to another quote by former Chief Justice McLachlin, because she says, "It is not to say that it is always illegitimate for governments to curtail expression, but government attempts to do so must be viewed with suspicion. This Liberal government does not deserve the benefit of the doubt on hate. It does not deserve the benefit of the doubt on protecting charter liberties. It does not deserve the benefit of the doubt on any of the problems that it has been instrumental in either allowing to fester or in some cases outright cause." So Bill C-9, the good is already done by additional laws, the bad should send a warning sign, and the Liberals should be very ashamed of trying to sneak this through the back door with a lower threshold for hate in a country that needs to protect and double down on free expression. Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Questions and comments.
Question and comment. Honourable member for Hamilton West and Ancaster Dundas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've got the real Conservative A-team this afternoon. Repeated Conservative conspiracy theories over and over in the House. If we want to talk about real hate crimes, and I'm not quoting, alt-right, so-called alternative news, talking about Jewish members in my community who are covering their Jewish identity in public. That is the hate that we're talking about that this bill seeks to address. So I'm trying to understand what is the member's opposite real objection to this legislation. And when they talk about freedom of expression, it seems more and more likely that what they're talking about is freedom for their members to say whatever they want without consequences. Is that the real objection? Thank you.
The honourable member for Elgin St. Thomas, London South.
Mr. Speaker, I wish the member had spent less time working on what he thought was a zinger and more time listening to my speech, where I detailed in excruciatingly, and I will argue painful detail, real hate that is occurring against Christians, against the Jewish community. I mentioned the firebombing of synagogues, the shooting of Jewish schools. And by the way, the member should be well aware that the Jewish community has looked at this Liberal government and been absolutely ashamed to be represented by people that have cozied up with the very people who are responsible for Jew hatred in this country. So I do not take any cues from this member who wants to accuse Conservatives standing up for freedom of being conspiracy theorists. He should be ashamed of that.
Hear, hear.
Question and commentaire. L'honourable député de Jonquière.
The honourable member for Jonquière. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was listening to my colleague. He said we should have mandatory minimums for church-based or synagogue-based vandalism. I can see where he gets this idea, but if you take it further, I wonder if my colleague would agree that the religious exemption for hate speech should be abolished or not. What does he think? Should we get rid of the religious exemption in this bill?
Thomas, London South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his question and his commitment to actually interrogating what is not in this bill. And the reason I raised what I did about the lack of stiff penalties for people who assault in heinous ways places of worship is because this is something that is not theoretical, it's not hypothetical. We see it happening on a sadly regular basis in this country, and it is not covered by this Liberal law. And Liberals in the past have actually been endorsing or rationalizing to some of these assaults on churches. So I think this is an important discussion, and I want to see real action on real hate, not lowering the threshold on how we define it.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Aurora, Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, peculiarly, this bill that the Liberals have put together addresses things that are already covered by the Legal Code of Canada. There's already laws protecting and actually speaking to things like the swastika and other things. Could the member elaborate a little bit further on why he thinks those things that are already covered by law in Canada are virtually being signaled by these Liberals in debate here in the House?
Member for Elgin St. Thomas, London South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague. And that is indeed one of the glaring issues with this. The parts of the bill that there's no objection to from me or my colleagues are things that are already illegal in Canada, making this redundant in a lot of ways. And I pointed to a recent case where someone was charged for displaying a hate symbol under existing hate laws. Now, I have to draw attention to the fact that not half an hour ago, I pointed this out to the parliamentary secretary to the Justice Minister, a lawyer herself, and she had no idea. She had no answer. So if the Liberals have not prepared for the most basic challenging of this, what else have they not actually investigated on their own legislation?
Time for a brief question. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, providing clarity and providing strong legislation is really critically important. And we are seeing that in this bill. The question I have for the member is, would he apply the very same principle that he is saying now with respect to this bill to private members' bills, which are numerous coming from the Conservative Party, where the criminal law already covers it? Would he suggest that we...
Elgin St. Thomas, London South, 25 seconds or less.
Thank you. I don't need that much time to say what I've already said because the member I don't think was listening, which is that we need to enforce the existing laws where they already cover what's happening in this country on hate. But moreover, we cannot allow the Liberal government to sneak into law a lower threshold for defining hate that will be used to curb free expression in this country.
Resuming debate. Please do that. The Honourable